So Prevention of Terrorist Act is the brother and the analog in India. And I think it got repealed because of its draconian measures. So they stopped calling it a Prevention of Terrorist Act, and they started calling it Information Technology Act, right? Because one of them was something scary, something negative, and the second one sounded like something enabling, right? So just by changing names, they were able to get away with a lot of crap. Sorry, I'm used to going to security conferences, and so pardon my language. So that brings us to freedom of expression. This is, again, a contentious issue. Basically, what this law talks about is if you're a service provider who is legally liable in the Indian jurisdiction, you have to take down any content that that anyone might not like within 36 hours of notice. Now, there's several people who have documented what kind of content is being taken down, and some of it is really silly, because India is a really, really surreal place. They have some really weird notions about morality in certain places, and they have some really weird notions about what is the right thing to say and what is not the right thing to say. Well, I guess it's as weird as any other country, but I find it more weird because I'm from there. But so basically, so sex education is usually not a part of our curriculum. So anything related to that might essentially be classified as pornography and taken down. I think that is scary, right? More importantly, unlike in the United States, where you have to, there's the whole takedown procedure, but then there's also a secondary procedure where you can actually question the takedown, and you can say that for whatever reasons you took my content down from your website, those reasons are not legitimate. There is not a similar procedure that will allow you to contest that decision, right? And so essentially, any political speech, or any religious speech, or any kind of speech that other people might not necessarily, that is not popular opinion, might be taken down within 36 hours, and you cannot contest that. I'll come to how, I will provide a real-life example of why this is really scary at the end of it. So censorship becomes a huge issue in India. Google has this thing called a priority reporting tool, where law enforcement agencies essentially don't even have to contact Google anymore. They can just file an application, and the content on the website. Orkut is, by the way, an Indian version of Facebook. It's a social networking site which is really popular in India and Brazil. I don't know if it's still very popular, but it used to be very popular. And now the government of India has asked Google, Facebook, Twitter, and I think 12 other companies to provide them with a measure that would automatically take down content from any of the services that they're providing. Otherwise, they'd be legally liable. And it's essentially the same thing. They have to take down the content within 36 hours of notice. Now, not to mention that this is a huge impediment for any kind of real dialogue related to religious issues or related to any kind of political speech, but it is also a huge problem for someone in the local market who's trying to build up their own services. Because trying to build in a system where you can take down content within 36 hours is a very expensive service, right? And it's not like that the government of India is actually reimbursing you for that service. You have to, if it's an automated process, you have to design the process yourself, right? If it's an off-the-shelf product, or if it's an off-the-shelf service that you're using, you have to buy that service yourself. Or in the worst case, you have to hire people to make sure that they reply to all of the complaints that they get within 36 hours, right? So this is a huge, it acts as a barrier for someone who's trying to start their own service in India. So it really acts as a barrier for some of the local participants who might want to start ICT services. So how does that come into play? So as I was talking about, these laws are enacted by people who are not very literate and don't really know much about information technology and how it works. So this is the case of this guy was an IT worker. I guess he was a programmer for a company based out of Pune. And one of these days, the cops knocked on his door. They arrested him and took him away to the jail, incarcerated him for 50 days based on the idea that he posted something online that was offensive and that originated from his IP address. How many people are aware of, how many people think that attributing content to an IP address is a good idea? How many people are, would consider themselves as tech nerds in this crowd? 3, how many people think IP attribution is a good idea? None, right? You don't need to be a tech nerd to realize that IP address is a very stupid idea because IPs are really, really, really easy to fake. I'm an economist and I can fake an IP. I'm just saying, it's really, really easy. So they incarcerated this guy for 50 days in an Indian prison, by the way. He was given a bowl from which he was to eat, he was to drink, and he was to do all his other bodily functions into, right? Finally, they realized that they screwed it up because they were looking at and by the way, this was dynamically assigned IP. This was not a static IP, this was a dynamic IP. So they screwed up because they asked for 2:30 in the afternoon, and the company that they asked the information from gave them 2:30 at night. So because the company that was providing the information made a mistake, some completely innocent person was incarcerated for 50 days and had to go through these living conditions. Finally, he filed a case with the Human Rights Commission. He won the case after 2 years, right? He was incarcerated for 50 days, and it took him 2 years to win the case, for which he was given 200,000 rupees, which is nothing, right? Which brings us to Section 67, because, if he didn't commit a crime and he was incarcerated, why didn't he just get a bail, right? Well, I guess bail is next section. Well, that brings us to the idea of arrest. One of the things is that if you're a law enforcement agent, you can essentially, you have the right to arrest without a warrant, as long as you are making that arrest in a public space. This, by the way, would be considered a public space, right? So unless you are inside your own private property, they can arrest you without a warrant. And that brings us to the idea of bail, that you cannot, most of these offenses are not bailable. So even though he was innocent, he cannot get a bail because he was arrested under Section 67 of this law. So no bail, and more importantly, even when these offenses are bailable, it is very, very hard to get a date for a hearing to set a bail. So the only reason he got away after 50 days is because the company contacted the law enforcement agents, and they told them, well, we made a goof up, we gave you PM instead of AM, and so this is the new IP address, and they arrested 3 other people who supposedly did the crime, right? Because we are still going by IP attribution. Oh, right. By the way, he was arrested under Section 67, which is really about transmitting obscene material. And so really it's about pornography. And it was actually not pornography, it was political speech. Because he was talking about some politicians and some historical figures, and he was supposedly talking about some politicians or some historical figures. So it had nothing to do with pornography, but that is the extent to which this act, there's the box in which you design obscene material, but this is how far the box spreads, right? That political speech also falls into obscene material. Now, this is where, so that was, you might think that, that was a solitary goofer, it's not really a big deal, but the problem is that the government agencies in India have too much power. And unfortunately, the the process is not as democratic as you would like it to be. And this came out when this Indian researcher proved that Indian electronic voting machines are very, very easy to break. Essentially, all you need is one copper wire, and you can hack into the machine, right? And you need the hacking capability of a 3-year-old, right? So it's not necessarily very hard. So he hacked these machines. He published a paper which got presented in a top-tier security conference in the United States. Meanwhile, so he never actually got to present that paper because he was arrested and taken away from his home by cops. He was not even charged with a crime, but essentially he would have been charged under this act, and he could have been incarcerated pretty much forever. I think he kind of got away because he was decently politically connected, and so it kind of helped his case. But in general, this is a huge problem because what you're doing is you're not allowing any criticism of the supposedly democratic process, right? I think this is, if you are in a democracy, and I do believe in democracy, I think it is very important to know how your democratic officials are getting elected, right? And if they are not getting elected from at least a reasonably foolproof process, that is a problem. And I think this guy brought out that problem, and he was arrested for that instead of being rewarded for his work, right? So what is the newish hope? The newish hope is, Tor. Are you guys aware of Tor? So one gentleman has, Tor is an anonymization network. Essentially what it does is, if you get onto Tor and you visit a website, it's very hard for someone to say who is visiting the website. It anonymizes you, right? It was considered very critical for the whole Arab Spring because it allowed people to go and exchange data without being monitored by the government. And it was also very helpful in uploading a lot of videos of what was happening on ground. So this is basically of how Tor usage increased from 2009 to mid-2010. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but there's a peak at the end of it. And so essentially Tor usage has gone up by 7 times. So one must ask, what was that interesting thing that happened during that period? There was a civil movement called India Against Corruption that built up during that time. And essentially what that movement was trying to do, that it was trying to get a bill called the Lokpal Bill passed through the parliament, which would basically hold many of the politicians and some of the higher up civil service people accountable for corruption in the government, and would make them disclose the incomes that they were generating and all that kind of stuff. And so it's actually still going. The bill's still not passed. So it started in 2009. This is 2012. The bill has not passed. So these are democratic things that are being impinged by this bill. The biggest problem is that the government of India can essentially claim anything to be, to be hurting the sovereignty of the country, and essentially declare that ICT asset as a protected asset and just take it offline. So you would simply not have access to a huge amount of information. So major criticisms: warrantless wiretapping, warrantless arrest, no provision for bail. Conclusion: this is the best thing. This is how a really good draconian law should be written, right? I will let you read this one and interpret it. If we wrongfully arrest you and if we wrongfully prosecute you, you cannot sue us. Essentially, that is what the bill is doing. So the government cannot be held accountable for the actions that they take, which is really not how democracy works, because for democracy to work, the government must be held accountable for its actions. That's all I have, I guess.